We didn't go anywhere. We didn't go to the movies. We didn't go to grocery stores. Like, it was a big, scary place out there. And I was taught to believe that world people were evil and they had no souls, and that, if you spent too much time with them, that could happen to you.
Hello and welcome. My name is Frida Faisal, and I host this YouTube channel where I explore the New York Hasidic subculture. Today's topic for my long-form interview series is cults, subcultures, and how we talk about them. A big part of what drives me with this channel is a desire to tell the story of the Hasidic community of my youth in a more nuanced way than how it's usually told. I find that usually subcultures like Hasidim, the Amish, communes, and so on draw great fascination from the wider society, but in extremely reductive ways. People love to hear about the crazy escape stories, the dramatic, the exotic rituals, the shocking dark sides. Netflix can't churn out these documentaries fast enough, and there are even some on Hasidism, like One of Us, which tells a dramatic, almost cult-like tale. So why is it? What drives our fascination? With me today to discuss these questions is the author Guinevere Turner, who herself comes from a unique childhood. Guinevere was born and raised in the Lyman Family commune or cult, of which you will hear more, hopefully, from her. She has written wonderfully about her story and how the world thinks of cults and communes. Her writing has given me a lot of food for thought. My own essay titled, "Is the Hasidic Community a Cult?" was influenced by her writing. Turner is a woman of many hats, a director, screenwriter, actress. She's the author of the memoir, When the World Didn't End, and of the New Yorker essay, My Childhood in a Cult. Welcome, Guinevere, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
Thank you, Frida.
And in preparing for this interview, I was reading quite a bit about the Lyman Family cult, which you grew up in, and I was quite surprised to read about it in Wikipedia and other places in ways that were shockingly dramatic. It was different from how I had first experienced that, the Lyman family, in your writing, My Childhood in a Cult, for the New Yorker. So I'm wondering if you would be okay with starting us off by telling us about your experience growing up in the Lyman family.
Yes, of course. I was born in 1968 in Boston. My mother had joined this family when she was pregnant. Of course, they don't call themselves a cult. No cult does. And the word cult is, to me, problematic. Like, I was told that they were a cult. I didn't come to that on my own. Somebody else, a therapist, said, "That's not a commune, that's a cult." So they had one leader, Mel Lyman, whose beliefs were kind of slippery. He was a musician. He wrote a book called Autobiography of a World Savior, which kind of says it all. But it was not Christian or particularly aligned with any, there wasn't an offshoot of some other faith, as many cult-like situations are. And, we were homeschooled. We had zero contact with the outside world. We didn't engage with television or any form of current, 70s culture. It was compounds around the country. So I grew up on the compound in Kansas, Martha's Vineyard, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, and am I forgetting one? San Francisco, for that one. So those were all existing, and people traveling among them and still are, most of them, for all of my childhood. And people's number one question is, what were the belief systems? And it was very kind of ever changing. Bear in mind, this is the 70s. This is the post-cultural revolution. So there's a lot of talk about consciousness and selflessness and being present. And there was a lot of astrology. And as my book suggests, when I was young, when I was 5, we were told that the world was going to end, and UFOs were going to come and take us to Venus. And of course, believed it. And of course, that did not happen. And that's the first thing that happens in my book, hence the title, because when the world didn't end, what happened is the rest of my life. So, that's the kind of overview. So, why am I not in it now? When I was
You lived,
11.
can I back up and say that you lived in kind of it sounds to me almost like a commune situation in the sense, or kibbutz in the sense that you didn't live with your parents, with either of your parents.
Yes, right. I forgot that part. So my mother was actually one of the adults in the family who was a breadwinner and kind of led a double life. So she lived in the New York property, um, and worked on Wall Street, and had that life during the day, and then would come home at night to this cult life. And my dad was never in it. My dad, when he found out that my mom was pregnant, said, I'll marry you and I'll move to Ohio. And, I have an uncle who works at who has a factory. And my mom was like, I'm going to join a cult instead, and just kind of ditched him. and, and I didn't meet him until I was 18. So yes. And so almost all of us being my generation when we were kids, weren't in the same place as our parents, or I was sent to visit my mom, and people's parents might come and go, but our primary care givers were other adults that weren't our parents. And that was kind of the culture of the place.
You know, having looked into your content in preparation for this video, I had a little bit of a sense that you maybe don't love to talk about your cult story. Am I getting the right sense? Because I have an ex-Hasidic story, and watching interviews with you, I felt you skirting around the tell your dramatic story in a way that I find myself doing. Am I reading it, or am I projecting?
Well, it's complicated, as you know, because while I don't agree with everything, I'm wildly opposed to a lot of the things that they did and the way that we were raised. I say we, meaning my generation, because it's kind of like I have 60 siblings, and several biological ones as well. I've talked about it a lot, and yet this is still hard to articulate. But you and people like you understand more than most. I don't want to invite people to think ill of them or to focus only on the negative things. I also know that they are paying attention. And though it be so many years later, I care. Like, I don't, my reason for writing the piece in the New Yorker, and then my reason for writing a book was, it's a really interesting story, and I'm a writer, and it just seemed crazy not to eventually write about that. It's such a, unique and complex story. But I'm not here for the cult groupies, and I'm almost hesitant to tell some of the weirder stuff, because that's kind of what everyone's waiting for. So I don't dislike talking about it. I'm just very wary of who I talk to and what I say, because I wouldn't want it to seem like I am capitalizing in some way on this experience, or, kind of selling it for sensational reasons. It's really not the place that I come from, but it's sort of the category that I'm in, because cult stories, as we know, and cult adjacent stories, like the community that you come from, are, people just can't get enough, but not in a healthy way, and not in a way that feels kind of objectifying, and alienating. And so I talk about it, but I talk about it cautiously. I don't want people to be like, what a bunch of freaks, even though a lot of the stuff they did was very weird.
Well, why do you think that you don't have this natural impulse to just milk the drama to the very end? Like, yes.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, a lot of the people that I grew up with, many of them are still either in the family, or they are still connected to it through their parents, or because they have kids, they want their kids to know their grandparents. And so I don't want to do them a disservice. And I'm not, I am a writer, and I have had success with other things. Like, I don't need this for attention, An editor said to me when I was meeting with different editors to write this book, she said, "You're very smart that you did a bunch of things, sort of made your identity, forged an identity in your work that has nothing to do with this. And then you talk about it. Because if you had started
Yeah.
out that way, written the book when I was in my 20s, it would have defined you. And I thought that was really smart. I couldn't really take credit for that decision. I just tried to write the book and just kind of couldn't for decade after decade after decade. But perhaps there was an instinct there. Like, let me forge an identity as all the other things that I am besides just this, and then be like, oh, and by the way, here's a crazy thing.
Yeah.
The number of people, especially people that I went to high school with, and people who were there but didn't know where I had just come from, they're just like, what? Like, had no idea, because I got really good at,
Hiding it. It was
yeah.
it was my impression that you had an instinct all along not to let yourself be defined by this story. Reading your stuff made me feel like I was putting myself a lot in your position, which is probably a big part of why I wanted to talk to you. But I have left the Hasidic community. I would say I have a story, leaving after an arranged marriage, fighting for custody, making sure I don't lose my child. All of that was not easy. People hurt me. People were good to me. It was a story. Thankfully, everything worked out okay, but I've never written a story in my book. And I've tried. And I think I'm reluctant to let it out because I know that the cult groupies would run with it. Even the reviews of your book had people saying, oh my God, that is a crazy cult she comes from. And I was surprised that people took that away from your book because I thought it was a very unconventional story about a very different subculture, but it wasn't like, oh my God, they were all drinking poison kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny too, because a lot of the people that I am in touch with, my generation who grew up in that family, some of whom are still in, the sort of, and the grapevine, as you can imagine, is intense. Even for the people I don't talk to, they talk to you know what I mean? Like, everybody knows everything, even all these years later. And many of them said to me directly, or I heard that they said that I was too easy on the family, that
Uh-huh.
I made it sound too nice. And that's interesting because I very deliberately wrote my book from the perspective of the child that I was, to just avoid all of that. It's none of it was weird to me. It was all just my life. And so it's interesting. I chose to do that because I also wanted to erase the possibility that somebody could say that's not how that happened. But if you're I'm not saying this is like scientifically what happened. I'm saying this is what I remember, and that's an absolute, right? You can't argue with me about what I remember. So that was, all of those things were kind of written in sort of an ironclad way to write it. Like, I'm just talking about me and my experience at the time, what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. It's mine. You can't take it. You can't argue with it. Um, but I'm curious for you, like, at what age did you leave?
Yeah, you left your little subculture when you were 11, and I think that in some ways there's not really a lot of similarities because I was 25, so that's very different. But I find it interesting that you seem to say that people expect you to tell the dark side, right? They're like, if you don't tell us about how horrible it was and emphasize it, then maybe you're in some way dishonest, to the point that you wrote the book almost defensively, making sure that you're not going to be accused of that. Why is it that, is there something specific about your childhood that, do you think, in all honesty, warranted an expose that these people rightfully demand, or do you think that there's more to it?
I know that after I left, was kicked out. Really, my joke is always, can I call myself a cult survivor if I beg to stay?
Can you
Really?
stop for a minute? Can we pause for a minute to say how you ended up leaving?
Yes. My mother left. under cover of night. She was in a different place than I was. I was in Kansas and she was in Boston, New York. So my mother left. And then the next day they told me that, and I felt sort of sad, but not very sad. I didn't really know her very well. And I was, the culture I grew up in, that wasn't, a lot of people didn't know their parents very well. But then they told me that I had to go with her and that I had to go live out in the world, which I was homeschooled. We didn't go anywhere. We didn't go to the movies. We didn't go to grocery stores. Like, it was a big, scary place out there. And I was taught to believe that world people were evil. They had no souls. And that, if you spent too much time with them, that could happen to you. And they weren't to be trusted. And so I really begged to stay. And they said, you can't, because every kid here has at least one parent in the family. And I was like, parents that we never see. Like, how is this person even relevant? But I think it was, looking back, I didn't understand then, but looking back, it was just legal. Do you know what I mean? They were just afraid that, that if push came to shove, not the fields of marijuana they were growing, they weren't worried about that.
Is that what they were doing?
Oh yeah. And probably we were not we were not legally schooled. Do you know what I mean? I think it wasn't like registered somewhere. They just taught us whatever, the astrological signs of the American presidents or whatever. So that is how I left. And so in my community of cult survivors, particularly, I'm part of a group of those of us who are born and raised in them, which is very specific, but there's nobody like us, really. I mean, you know what I mean, in terms of like identifying with certain kinds of experience. I always joke, can I call myself a survivor if I begged to stay, which I most definitely did. I begged more than one person over the course of several days. So yeah, that's how I ended up leaving, and I never had that moment of still being there and deciding that there was something bad about it, as many people have who have left these situations. And what I do know, all the way back to your question about, why are my peers from this family disappointed in saying that I let the family off easy, the adults, the older generation, it's because I know from many of them that after I left and when all of us started becoming teenagers, the adults were just drunk all the time, every night, blackout drunk and very violent. And it's when my generation started to like think maybe we don't only want to be with each other because we feel like siblings and that would be weird. Or maybe we want to go to college, or maybe this life just isn't for us and we want to see what the rest of the world is. It caused, huge clashes and violence and horribleness, like really, really horrible stuff. And I missed all of that.
I see.
Lucky, I guess. I don't know. Like it wasn't easy what happened to me instead, but I do think that they're, and some of them have said it got so much worse after you left. Not because of me, just because of the timing. I think it was inevitable that a generation of teenagers would maybe not agree with that life, or what was expected of them.
Which was a lot of, you seem to have a lot of animals on the farm. It was like a big, giant property with like livestock, and it sounds almost in some ways like a long ago kind of way, or in a different country where you slaughtered chickens for dinner and you were extremely comfortable in nature. Thinking back, I don't even know how to ask you. I kind of wonder if you think back fondly to your childhood up until you left.
Yes, I really do. I mean, I loved so much about it. I loved all of we lived in beautiful places. The property in LA had a pool and a tennis court, and the Kansas property, as you said, was just so much land and animals and just running wild in nature all the time. And similarly on the vineyard, or Martha's Vineyard. So yeah, and I am still friends or have become friends with many of the girls that I grew up with. And I love them. They're my family. I have less love for the older generation, especially the ones who I used to think, oh, well, they were never bad, or they were never violent, or they were never manipulative. And then I'm like, but they sure did stand by. They, you know what I mean? Everybody knew always what was happening. So as I get older, I get less and less forgiving of the older generation. But I feel like most people, no matter how they feel about their childhoods, have things about, if you grew up in a weird, traumatic, what looks like weird to other people kind of way, there's almost always some stuff that's good. Even, regular old nuclear families, it's like maybe you had an alcoholic dad, but you still had a great time playing with your sister. It's more complex. There's a lot of good things happened, which I think confuses people.
Yeah.
They want, what people don't, it's a struggle that I had also, have had with therapists. So the first thing they want to do is work out my relationship with my mother. And I always say, which is not very good. And I always say, you have to understand.
She's around?
Yeah, she is. You have to understand that when you grow up in a culture where biological parent-child relationships are devalued and everyone around you is experiencing the same thing, it's not a wound that necessarily needs healing. Like, she's just a person I know. And yes, she's my mother, but I always feel like I want to talk to adopted people. It's like you can connect and feel something for someone who's not biological and not feel anything for someone who's biologically connected. But people are so hung up on how you must have a good relationship with your mother. I'm like, not where I come from. It doesn't matter. It's not the most important thing. To me, the most important thing is the sisterhood that I have with my generation.
Very interesting. What does your mother say now about the Lyman family looking back at it?
Good girl. Sorry.
That's okay. What's her name?
Good. Marbles.
Can we see her?
Yeah, of course. You want to come see? You want to come be on TV? Yes.
Oh, hi, Mar. Oh, she loves you. She's not interested in the camera. She's interested in you. Oh, I think you love her back.
I love her so much.
How old is she?
She is probably 6. She's a rescue, so I've had her for 5 years.
Oh, lovely.
And they were just a little baby girl.
Oh, very cute.
My mother. So you were saying, what does my mother think about it now?
Yeah, yes. What's her, because there's a very interesting distinction to me about your story between the people who were born into the Lyman family and the people who chose it. And that's that generational distinction between you and your mom.
I actually interviewed her a few months ago because I'm creating a podcast that's kind of interviewing, just sort of my adult presence instead, as opposed to what I did with the book, which is I'm very much a kid and you don't really know how I feel about it as an adult. And I interviewed my mother, and I don't talk to her a lot, so it was really interesting to just be like, well, but can I interview you? And she said some really surprising things. One of which is, we were just talking about, I was like, so Mom, did you really believe we were going to go to Venus? I mean, like, you're college educated, you understand that, like, I don't know, let's just start with, Venus is not inhabitable by humans because of the like, let's just start there. She was like, well, she's very wishy-washy about things like that. I don't know if she's embarrassed, but then she said something that I was like, what is happening? She said, but the spirits that we spoke to with the Ouija board, those were real.
She believes that.
What? Yeah, I had no idea. And I was like, Mom, it's a Ouija board. It's just people manipulating you by it. And she goes, no, it was real. She's like, you can call it the Jungian collective or whatever, but that was really spirits talking to us. I was like, oh, okay. You're crazier than I thought. And she doesn't, it's hard to get her to talk about it. I did finally, she was, she left me a message or left me an email or something. And I was like, Mom, I can't really talk to you until you read the book. Like I need you to know that that is what is out in the world, and you don't come out right. And I feel like I need you to know what I've said. And so she
She
did
doesn't
read
want to
it.
read it? Oh, she did.
She did. I told her, like, I can't know you if you haven't read this book. It's just too weird. She did. And she kind of chickened out talking about it, but she did say that it changed her life, but that she
Oh,
didn't
really?
elaborate. Yeah, she's a very dramatic woman.
I was going to say about your book, your mother after she left with your sister and later the other children she had. It's really really hard not to be upset at her because of the abuse you guys suffered and the way that she often enabled it. Did she talk to you about it at all afterwards? Did she say something, or you just needed to know that she knows what you said about her?
Yeah, no, she didn't. She really didn't. Um, I asked her to. She was texting me as she was reading it. So like while she started the book, and I was just waiting for her to get to the part where she kind of comes off as a monster. And I finally said, "Mom, you cannot live tweet me. It's too stressful for me. You have to read the whole book because I can't like, she's like, oh, I remember that, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, stop. Like, I can't, I don't want to read it with you. I want you to read it on your own. Uh, and then she just wrote me an email that just said it changed her life and she'd love to talk about it sometime. And that was September.
And then you
So
interviewed her?
I interviewed her maybe in November, and I was really for that just focused on her experience. Why did you join? How did you leave? How did you lead a double life working on Wall Street and then coming home to this? It was kind of just getting the story of her joining and leaving, which was plenty for an hour. She had a lot to say and a lot of details I didn't know. Not the least of which is that my dad actually got an apartment in Ohio and was there waiting for her. And she
Wow.
was. I always thought that he said he would do that, and then she said no. I didn't realize that he did it, and she blew him off, which I just think is very mean, especially if you know my dad.
You don't talk in the book about reuniting with your dad at all. Do you mind sharing?
Yeah, I when I was 18, so my mom and dad went to high school together. They they said they were high school sweethearts. I kind of think they were drinking buddies who had sex. I think they were really good
Okay.
friends. My dad went to a high school reunion, and everybody was asking about me and my mom. And this was when I was 18. I was a freshman in college. And so somehow somebody got in touch with me and said, your dad wants to meet you. And I was like, tough guy, just like, okay, no big deal. Because I was so used to not having a father that it wasn't this like, and because of the way I grew up, it wasn't like this big empty space of longing. And, I didn't really think that much about it. I mean, I did a little bit. Like I would, be in a dentist's office and just kind of play the game of like, what if that dentist is my dad? Like, would we look at each other and be like, who are you? Or could I have already interacted with my dad sometime in my life and neither of us felt it? So I thought about it in that way, but very abstract, sort of more intellectual than emotional, and scientific. Like if you put a father and daughter in a room together and they talk to each other, well, eventually they'll be like, there's something about you. I was in at Sarah Lawrence College in New York State, and then I flew to North Carolina where he was, and I thought I didn't care until my layover in Pittsburgh, and I just started crying, and I was like, "Why am I? What is this? Is this real?" I was just really overcome. I don't know what that was. I maybe I sort of at least process like this is a big moment. Like people have parents, they have two of them, and like there's only two of them, and you're about to meet one of them. And I didn't. I had a photo of him from his high school yearbook, but this was 18 years later. So I didn't really know what he looked like. And when I got off the plane, this was 1988 or something, so you could go right up to the gate. and I was very nervous. I didn't recognize him, but what I did recognize was the guy looking for his long lost daughter. Like I just recognized, like
There
that's
was
what
that
that guy
look.
would look like all stressed and kind of like ready but not sure. And I think he had a photo of me, and I look a lot like my mom. So uh, but then he told me years later that he went like this to like maybe three other women, young women. Gotta love him for his honesty. So yeah, so and he actually passed away last year.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lovely man. And I have two brothers, his sons with his wife. And he passed away 3 days before my book came out. So he
Oh,
never read, which is kind of good because, as I joke with my brothers, dark humor, it would have killed him.
why?
He was raised Catholic, so guilt, no matter how you actually feel about God and all the the Catholic things, guilt was sort of ingrained in him, and I think he always felt guilty because he knew I had a tough time, and I think
Yeah.
it would have killed him to read the details, and that none of that would have happened.
Of after
Yeah.
you left. Yeah, it's very, very, very painful, difficult to read. Um, did so Mel Lyman was this musician, absolutely weird character, skinny guy, right? Who seemed to have real beliefs that he is some kind of world savior, or was he tongue in cheek? I mean, his language is so grandiose that he sounds like he might be kidding or is on drugs, maybe both. But one thing that came through was it was a very musically based sort of commune. And you learned to play the banjo. Was your dad like into music? Your mom into music? Were they drawn to Mel Lyman because they were musical people? Or was he not drawn to Mel Lyman at all? Your dad? He was
No,
just
my
with your
dad
mom.
wasn't at all. I think he sold them weed for a little while until he went off to college. No, my dad wasn't into it at all. And they're both music lovers, but not music players. My parents. My mom got sucked in via their free publication called The Avatar, and she was reading that. I think it was like a monthly thing that they were giving out in the streets to people who looked like-minded. This is 1968, so you could tell who was who, politically,
Mm.
culturally.
Oh, I see. The
Uh,
hippie
and
look.
yeah, and she started working for the Avatar because she liked the words, and the words were mostly Mel Lyman's. Kind of long, complicated, turning in on itself, kind of spiritual logic that, like you said, you're like, is he spoofing this, or is he doing it? Does he believe it? And is it drug induced? And I still don't know the answer, honestly. I mean, drugs. I mean, they did acid and they smoked pot, but it wasn't like a constant thing. They sort of used acid in a more like one person would take acid and everybody would kind of stay with them. You know what I mean? It wasn't like everybody was always tripping at all. So I don't think it was drug induced. I think that he was. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, that's the weird thing. People are, what did he believe and what was real? And I'm like, I was a kid. It was all very, very real to me. And I remember reading his book, endlessly reading his book called Mirror at the End of the Road. Um, when I was a kid, it was a big part of our education, and thinking to myself, I'll understand this when I grow up. And when I
Wow.
was writing the book and reading it again, I was like, hey, baby Guinevere, no, you won't.
You were such a precocious child. You had all these diary entries that you include in the book, and it's very clear you were very, very precocious and also very emotionally intelligent and a writer from the start.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely a writer. I read a review. It was like on Goodreads or something, so it's just regular people. I read a review that's like, this just seems like a book about a really precocious child. I was like, it's really,
I
I
hear
mean,
that.
I would be such a corrupt human if I made up those diary entries. But that really is how I wrote. And it makes me laugh to read them. I'm like, oh, I'm so serious, and I use big words, and I'm really thinking about the big things, but that wasn't just me. We were raised to think about the big things, to think about existence and being present and your soul and, your place in the world, and, just really like big concepts always, and like getting in trouble for, being in a bad place. But you're like, but I'm 8. I don't know what you mean. It was very, so we were raised to have deep thoughts and be in almost a constant state of anxiety about if we were doing the right thing, being present, giving enough love, being who we were meant to be. If we let, I write about this in the book, how I was told that we were all told that Earth in the planets, Earth is school, and that you keep coming back to Earth until you learn your lesson. With reincarnation. But the twist on it for me was that I had been back too many times. Like that, this was like my billionth life, and that I had, just not learned the thing. And I was here one more time to learn something. And that as a kid it was crazy making, because I would just be like, is that what I'm supposed to learn? What I'm supposed to learn? Where's the thing? Will I know it? When will I learn? Will I die the minute I learn it? Like, what will happen? So, big ideas. I mean, not unlike people who are raised in organized religious communities that are, in which, every day is talking about scripture and engaging with those practices. Those are big things that, the religious texts and religious thoughts. And right. I mean, you were, I'm sure, raised to think about God and existence for as long as you can remember, right?
Yeah. And also, I think there are some children who really internalize it, and become very serious and very earnest, and they carry a tremendous load because of the messages that they hear about very big topics. And then there are some children that it sort of washes off of. And reading your story, it was clear that you really, really carried the load of how am I to not be a selfish person, which is a theme in your diaries. You want to tell the story of the Ouija board, for instance, of what happened?
Yeah, that was actually when I was talking about my mom. That's what she said. She said Phaedra was real. Phaedra is the spirit so Phaedra was. There were many spirits that adults talked to via the Ouija board, and they had transcripts and notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of these conversations with spirits. But there was one spirit, Phaedra, who was the only one who talked to kids, and so the older girls would take out the Ouija board, and we had fancy Ouija boards, all like homemade and handcrafted, and they're all different, and have a session with Phaedra, and all the kids crowded around. And in this one time, Phaedra, it was a big deal if Phaedra talked to you personally, and Phaedra said that I was lazy.
Oh.
And I was so excited that I was, I was called Jenny until I was 9. So I was like, when they said, Jenny, you are, and I was like, ready, a lazy little girl. And it was just so crushing. And everybody, all of the kids who were there in Kansas kind of looked at me like, and everybody was like, Phaedra said, and I just like ran away and started like cleaning ashtrays. And just to this day, I will say to myself, stop being so lazy. And I'm like, no, you're not lazy. You're tired. You're distracted. You do a lot. Like, I cannot believe that Phaedra is still in there where anything that I do, I can't achieve. I'm like, I'm lazy. And I'm like, no. That is just a weird thing that happened to you with a Ouija board when you were a kid.
Yeah. And then the therapists are like, so let's talk about your mother. They have no idea what.
Can we talk about Phaedra, who's a spirit? Who really did that? She did some emotional damage to me, even though she's not real.
Maybe you'll get side-eyed a little bit on your first session. Let's tell people what happened to Mel Lyman. You saw him like once when you were very young. You interacted with him like once or twice.
I did, because by the time I was old enough to sort of be aware of what was really going on, He had already kind of switched so that he was always asleep during the day and awake at night. And it's not until much later, long after I left, that I realized that he was sick. And so I think he was doing that night schedule because he was trying to hide that from, everybody from the family. But he died when I was 10, 9. And they didn't tell everyone that he died, but they did tell a couple of his kids. And one of his kids, Daria, was my close friend. And so she told me. And so I knew that he was not alive, but most of the adults didn't. And that was very weird and kind of stressful because they would talk about him like he was alive. And because Jessie, who was kind of really the leader, a woman, she would go into his room and be there all night and then come out and say things that he said, which I knew wasn't true because he was dead. And she knew that I knew that he was dead, but so many of the adults didn't. And it was just I somehow just had this constant anxiety that someone was going to find out that I knew he was dead and I was going to be in trouble for it.
Wow.
So yeah, and honestly, that was the case when I left. And I don't know if there was a day where there was a big announcement that he was dead, but certainly I know that it went on for years. The people that they kept up the appearances that he was alive, and only maybe like 5 people knew that he wasn't. And he had 13 kids. I think only one of them knew that he wasn't. And the woman, his wife, his child bride, knew that he wasn't because she lived in a room off of his room and he wasn't there. So she knew and couldn't tell.
But she was never actually married to him, the child bride, right?
No, but they did talk about it. They did call it that. That he was
Right,
her wife, and that she not legally.
Outside, I know that the children were matched up, and even though there was not a wedding, they were at times called spouses. But this particular character, this particular woman or girl, actually, she never actually had a relationship with Mel, did she? Because he got sick.
Well, she did. I mean, she was already married to him when he was alive for maybe like two years before he died.
Oh, I see.
So she did, what actually physically happened between them, I don't know. She is my good friend now today, and has been for like the past 15 years. But it's not the kind of thing you ask, it's
Yeah, that
like
makes
not,
sense.
it's, I maybe she'll talk about it someday, but she's doing so well and thriving in her life that I almost hate that I'm in her life because it reminds her of, it took her till she was 27 to get out. So,
Wow.
she was in it. She was really in it. And it was a real struggle for her to finally break free. Yeah, I really, really want for her to tell her story because that story makes my story look like a day at the beach. And she's like, I'm not a writer. She owns a landscape company, but I'm going to interview her for my podcast. And I hope that when I do that, that somebody will say, let me help you write a book because, that story needs to be told. And my story is the tip of the iceberg. Like there's an entire group of people who are my age who either never left or left when they were teenagers, when they were in their 20s. I'm about to interview a woman who is my mom's generation, who's was a big part. I mentioned her in the book a couple of times. Her name is Yvonne, who left. She said she left right after I did. And I'm so excited to talk to her and just like what it was, what her experience was. I never in a million years would have thought that person would have left. She was so kind of devoted and subservient and, had very little power. But when you think about it that way, of course she wanted to leave. She had very little power.
What's really interesting is that the group is still around today. Usually you think of these cults of personality groups as dissipating with the death of its single magnetic figure. What do you think held it together? Like what's happening there?
Well, up until last year, It was Jessie. She absolutely stepped in and became the leader and kept all of it alive. And so, yeah, that,
What
and,
motivated her?
I do not, that is like the question for the ages. Um, I don't know. I really don't know. There's another thing at play here that I've only recently started to think about, which is that for a lot of my mother's generation, perhaps by the time they decided, oh, maybe this isn't good, or not, this isn't serving me well, or I don't want to be here anymore, they were already in their 40s and had never had a job, and wouldn't even know how to go out in the world and get started, without any sort of, regular people life skills. And so I think that's also probably at some point became a tipping point for a lot of people staying, is that what the heck else were they going to do? This is their life. And again, beautiful houses, everything paid for, a life that's not, it wasn't meager. You know what I mean? It was those are beautiful places. I'm very curious to know what's happening to them now, like how finally losing their leader, central, queen figure, has affected them. But they're like in their 70s, many of them close to 80. So I imagine they're like, well, this is it. This is our life. Let's just live it out. So I don't know. I'm curious. I'm hoping to find out more about that when I talk with Clotilde, who I was talking about earlier, the one who was married to Mel Lyman as a kid.
Very interesting. I look forward to the podcast. That's going to be very, very interesting addition to your storytelling on all of this. I really like the concept. What do you think? Do you think it's a cult? What do you think defines a cult to you?
Again, question for the ages. What is a cult?
Yeah, what is
And
a
what
cult?
is it? And what is a religion accepted, a socially acceptable cult? If a belief system and specific kind of subculture around schooling and what you wear and who you interact with is part of it. I mean, it's sort of a slippery term, and one that, certainly gets thrown at the Hasidic community and many other communities that are really just really specific religions. Some would say extreme because of, whatever. I would say, though, that, I was going to say just now, I was going to say apocalyptic vision, as, they had, but the second
Religions
coming.
have that too. Yeah, religions have that too.
Like it's not. It's just a really successful cult, Christianity. I mean, the real thing about cults is what defines it is the isolation. I think the isolation and sort of almost denial of outside culture, or refusal of it. The isolation that leads to a kind of control if you are separated from the family that you grew up with, or from the people that you knew that aren't in the family. So ultimately, I guess
That would also make that would like make the Amish a cult by that definition.
Yeah. I mean, the difference is that sometimes I just think it's just numbers. Numbers and time. It's like, yeah, but also the word cult sort of comes with a presupposition of abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like abuse and manipulation, are people doing things that they were manipulated into doing rather than of their own free will. I mean, the Amish are they have their Rumspringer, like they're, you know what I mean? They're like, yes, go party, come back if you want to. I feel like the Amish aren't a cult because they have that. You know what I mean? Like not only is there not a stigma around not being Amish, there's a part of their culture is you're welcome to go and see what the rest of the world is like, and you're welcome back if you want to come back. I mean, that's pretty cool of the Amish, I think.
I don't know. I recently had an Amish gentleman on a walking tour. Well, he was ex-Amish, but he disputed the whole Rumspringa. He said it's like hardly a thing, and he
here I am believing it. Oh.
We all, I think it's the kind of thing that sticks in our mind, and it's like to some degree there's some validity to it, but to him he was like completely exaggerated. We were like a group of 10 people and we all just wanted to talk about Rumspringa to him. No one was interested in talking about the history of Brooklyn.
Um, I mean, what do you say when people say that Hasidic communities, especially the one that you grew up in, I think, because it's very orthodox, yeah. Like when they call it a cult, like how do you define a cult?
I find that cults are a very negative term that are thrown at other people that live differently, and it almost implies that the main culture is free of any of the problems that the cult is being accused of. For instance, instances of molestation, abuse, and so on. So there'd be like, oh, it's a cult because I read about sexual abuse that happened in this situation. Well, that doesn't make it necessarily a cult because stuff happens in the larger culture too. So like I feel like it's so heavily steeped in an accusation that certain problems exist only in the subculture when they don't, that I really dislike the term.
Agreed. I've often said that at least the cult that I grew up in, it's just like the patriarchy, but it's on steroids. It's just like a nuclear family with a controlling, father or mother and an abusive household, just on steroids. Which is to say, yeah, there's still sexual abuse, domestic violence, coercion, coercive control. Like those things happen among humans in many, many different contexts.
Yeah, exactly. What do you think would have happened if you hadn't left the commune when you were 11? Do you think you could have stayed to today? Thought
I
experiment.
I know I've thought about it often. In many ways, the hardest thing that ever happened to me is the best thing that ever happened to me because I'm pretty sure, knowing myself, that once I became a teenager, I would have uh, pushed back. I would not have wanted to be married off to a much older man. I would not have wanted to continue to be, to serve men in these very kind of old, ideas, like not even like, like really just women there to serve men, no matter what. I think I would have rebelled. And also, I'm gay. Like the gay thing was not that was gonna
Yeah.
not gonna go over well, and it did not for the few people who were my generation who came out. Um, but it would have been so much harder. Like everybody would have been
Yeah.
mad at me, and there would have been drama and violence, and from what I hear from everybody else, I would have had to claw my way out of there. So I'm pretty sure, but I don't want to sound smug. Maybe not. Maybe I would have gotten very used to the life. Maybe something would have happened to me that really made me want to stay. I can't say for sure, but at my core, I feel that I would just I wouldn't want to be controlled.
I see.
Hard to say though. You just don't know until you're there because I know from my friend Clotilde who didn't leave until she was 27. She tried since she was 20. It would not have been easy. So maybe I would have given up. It doesn't sound like me though. I don't
I can't see it. I can't see it, to
know.
be honest. It's my guess. So what do you think? Why do you think people love to hear your story about your childhood in a cult? What is your theory about why this is so much of a commodity?
Well, it's interesting, and I don't really know the answer, but weirdly, cults are kind of always put into this true crime category. Um, and to me, so the question you just asked me is the same question of why do people love true crime? Other people's misery is entertainment. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes I feel that there's something that soothes people. Like, well, my life might be messed up, but it's not that messed up. Like it's almost affirming to people that they're doing okay, or that that's one theory that I have, like that, because it just has to come down to some basic human nature, right? That we're like,
Yeah.
oof, that doesn't happen to me, and somehow it's like a roller coaster ride. You're like, but you're safe. You know what I mean? This is one theory. Do you have a theory? It's a question
Yeah,
I can never stop talking about, especially with people like you who obviously thought about it and talked about it.
I have a very similar theory. I think there's an affirmation of the benefits of Western society built into cult stories of saying, well, maybe we have all of these challenges. Maybe our lives are in drudgery and hard in life, but thank God we have X, Y, and Z. We have freedom. We have whatever these people don't have. We have. We're feeling better about our lot now. So there's a kind of a affirmation of a lifestyle inherent to looking at the dark side of cults, and that's why not only cults but also subcultures, and that's why people don't want to hear like, oh, here's a day in the life of an Amish woman, how meaningful and joyous it is for her to be, washing the cloth in the, I don't know, basin, and do these things on the farm. People don't want that. They want, I'm so oppressed, thank God I freed myself from that oppression, because that is seeing the misery that is in the other lifestyle, which then by extension affirms the lifestyle that people are living. What do you think of that?
Yeah. And what I think is interesting about that is that we don't hear about the quote unquote cults that don't commit crimes or don't have, ex members who speak out, which means to me that there might be tons of what most people would call cults that are doing just fine. Either that or they're really good at hiding their crimes. But it is important to note that just because misery and crime are good stories, that's the stories that get told. You don't hear. I would love to see a documentary about a utopian community that's just doing just fine, but that's not a good story. Everyone will be like, "Why? Who
Yeah,
cares?"
yeah, yeah,
you know,
exactly.
and that's it's all the cults we know about are cults that mass suicide and murders and all of that, coercion and branding. Um, that's juicy stuff. So
Yeah,
anyway, that's the other side of cults, is that the word cult is associated with crime because that's what's on TV and that's what's
yeah.
in books, and that's the ex members who speak out are usually speaking about heinous things that happen to them or the people around them.
Yeah. When I find myself clicking on a cult story on Netflix, like I was watching this documentary about this couple that turned themselves into gurus, and everything was on Zoom, so there's a lot of files that that it's not exaggerated. They
Twin
really,
flames, yeah.
yeah. And I think there's also an element of, is that really happening? That draws us into something
Yeah,
so
and I think
different.
that then there's this weird, related to what we were saying earlier about people saying my life may be difficult, but it's not weird like that, is that it makes people feel smart because they think that people who fall for belief systems are not smart, or that they're gullible and lost, and in many ways they're I don't think those people are lost. I think that they are spiritual seekers who get taken advantage of. Um, but that's another thing I think that people are like, God, I would never believe those horrible people on Zoom. Like, how do those dumb people get sucked into that? And I'm like,
Yeah, yeah,
people who are good at manipulating people are good at manipulating people. I always
yeah.
want people to just don't, like, people watch it like that would never be me. And I always want to discourage them from thinking that way, because you just don't know what thing you might encounter at some point in your life that it just speaks to you. And then you find yourself sucked into something that turns out to be a lie or abusive. I feel like
Yeah.
I would never get sucked into a money one. That's the one thing that I don't think I would get sucked into, because it just looks. I mean, the thing is, I'm predisposed to not get sucked into anything because that's how I was raised. If anything feels at all belief systemy or whatever, I'm always like, nope, no thanks.
But yeah, I don't know. Money doesn't speak to me enough to ever like think that's. I think we all have our pain point, our tender point that someone can touch on, and then there's a whole side of us that we don't realize is so vulnerable. We want something really, really badly. Then, if someone touches on that, we can really be manipulated beyond our own self assessment. And money, I don't know.
Mhm.
Money is, I think, not that really tender spot for most people, where it's very deep. By the way, I have a question about your mother, because I kind of imagine people who join such groups to be the kinds of people who get really taken in on fads. Would you say she's like that, or is that like my like?
You
Oh,
mean
today I'm
no?
all on.
I'm thinking actually because she actually in like the early aughts, there was a guy who came to speak to her at like a corporate retreat thing, and she became obsessed with this guy, and she really, really wanted us to meet him. And me and my sister, she's like, oh, he's in town, like, and he's doing a conference. Will you girls please come? And I was like, my sister was a teenager, and I was like in my 20s or 30s, and we went, and he was 100% super culty, and
Wow.
like we were, we had to like hold hands and look each other in the eye for a long time, and my
Oh.
sister and I were just like, laugh, don't laugh, don't laugh. I can't believe mom's in another cult. It was called E, but she didn't, but so she just talked about him a lot. I can't remember his name right now, but she would just be like, well, blah, blah, blah says, and blah, blah, blah says. So yeah, there's a piece of her that's, I mean, she's like, I guess, yeah, there is a piece of her that's always kind of looking for meaning and, has a spiritual seeker, but in a way that's kind of, that does make her a bit of a danger to herself because she gets sucked into things.
Yeah, gets very enthusiastic about the people.
Yeah.
Anything else? I have a final question, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you wanted to speak to before I ask my final question.
Just one thing that is relatively recent in my cult journey, so to speak, which is that, as I was saying, like therapists have often not understood me, and I just get frustrated because, the first 5 sessions is me explaining where I come from. I halfway wrote a book just so I can give it to a therapist to be like, don't charge me for reading this, but this, you need to know this. Because it's, you know what I mean? It's a lot to explain. Not just like my parents got divorced when I was 10, So I've been frustrated with sort of the mental health support around, cult related kind of, issues. And then I found this organization called the Lalich Center on Cults and Coercion, and they run by this woman, Dr. Yanya Lalich, and I just got into support groups on Zoom with people who are raised in cults, and that's the most healing and affirming and moving thing that's ever happened to me. And I do wish there's an alternate universe in which I go to school to become a therapist so that I can be a cult specialist therapist, because I do wish that there was more understanding of it from a real kind of place of not like, oh, let me, you were, raised in a cage, or you know what I mean? Like they really sort of understanding it holistically. And I feel like it's probably going to start with people who know it firsthand or know situations like it. So
yeah,
I just want to encourage anyone who's listening to become a cult therapist because we need. And it took
how
me
many people are there even
in the group that I'm in?
No, in general, people who come from such closed societies. Are there many?
When I wrote the essay that was published in the New Yorker, and then when I wrote the book, I mean, not a week goes by where somebody doesn't get in touch with me who's like, I was raised in this thing, or I escaped from this thing, or I'm becoming this sort of like cult beacon. So many people, wow. And in the support groups that I'm in, they divide them into smaller sections, but they are, there's like maybe 200 people, and they're not like me that got out of cults that were in the 70s. They're people who got out of, an offshoot of Jehovah's Witnesses, offshoot of Christians, Mormons, a lot of that where, it just wasn't extreme enough. And so their parents or a group of people, broke off and, made it very extreme and made it cult-like. So and they're young, they're fresh out, they're all over the world. I mean, it's pretty incredible how many people there are, because we don't know it because most people like me don't talk about it all the time because people are too into it, and I can't start from scratch. And so I feel like there are a lot more people around us who have these kinds of experiences or know people who just don't talk about it because it's a whole thing, and you just want to be like, I'm from upstate New York. which is how I begin my
Yeah.
piece in the New York, because I just, once you start talking about this stuff, people are just, their eyes just get, you know. So anyway, so
Yeah.
the cults are very, very much thriving. And now with the internet, there's the whole, there's a whole new avenue of a way to manipulate people. So I don't want anyone to think that, once my generation dies out, this generation of, the children of a failed utopia, I like to call us, and there's a lot of us, because a lot of people had some big ideas in the 60s and 70s and they didn't really work. Um, I just want people to know that it's thriving. I mean, Nexium was
Still.
just a corporate retreat that turned it really, really crazy. It's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
it's around in all kinds of ways. So I don't know. I just want people to know that, not for people to be scared, just for people to not think that it's so far away in the past, or so far away physically distant wise.
I think as our society is so individualistic, there's a constant desire to find the balance with community, and sometimes that ends up going awry. People sometimes find individualism people are so lonely and they are so searching for something grounding, and there's always going to be an opportunity for manipulators or very charismatic people who like power to take advantage of that. Even though we think of cults as something in the past, we think we're more enlightened than that. We keep thinking, we as people seem to keep thinking that we're beyond certain human fallacy, human mistakes, and we go back there again and again.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of the things that I've been trying to write an essay about everything that we're talking about, sort of cults and contemporary culture, and I can't. I just have all these pieces of it, but so I have all these sort of phrases in my head of when I figure out how to write this, they're going to be there, and I just lost what it was that I was going to say. Um, Cults are
We were talking about
everywhere.
individualists.
Oh, I know what it is. It's that it's a when people talk about cults, there's this kind of ooh them over there, and I'm like, cults, let's face it, are a part of our culture, particularly American culture. Like, it's not just like a weird thing that happens now and then. It's always happening, and we're always hearing about a new one because it does something, that it gets busted doing something. But it's not us and them, it's us. Like, we're all, this is part of our culture. It's a
Interesting.
real thing.
Yeah, but
You know?
I'm thinking now. I know this European guy who grew up in what he calls a commune, where there was very loose concept of adult relationships. It was monogamous, and he grew up with nudity being ever present. I bet that we would consider that. Most people would probably also dub it a cult. No, I don't even know. It's so hard with what qualifies
Well,
as a cult.
like, have you read much, or engaged much with stuff about the children of God?
No, what is it?
Oh, oh,
What?
oh. Well, it's a very thriving cult that it has become international. Um, uh, I'm trying to think. Some famous people grew up in Children of God, Rose McGowan and the Phoenix Kids. Um, but I know a bunch of people who grew up in it, and their thing is that everybody should be sexual always, and you can never say no, and involving children. That's one of the many
Oh
things.
wow.
And it's thriving, and it has been since, I think, it started in the 60s. And so that kind of, and they're very sort of nudist forward. Like, that's a cult for sure. That's one of the scariest ones and one of the most thriving ones. But I don't know that necessarily, if you're living in a community that's not monogamous and there's a lot of nudity. I guess the thing is, that's fine if you're all adults, but if you raise kids that way, that's when it gets questionable, because
Yeah, yeah.
that's not how society works, and consent issues and all of that. So I don't know, the European one you're talking about is sort of like, have to really get in and be like, the checklist. Does anybody
Yeah.
have their own money? Are people in touch with their families outside of it? Is there an apocalyptic vision sneaking around somewhere? Does anyone think they're God? you know, because I
Those
don't,
are
because one thing that there's kind of no way to get a group of people together living, and trying to have a life together where power dynamics don't emerge. Some people are natural leaders. Some people, if they
Yeah.
get that leadership position, will get more powerful and then will believe their own hype and then will become exploitive people. Like power corrupts, you know? So I do
Yes.
feel like that the idea, just the idea of a commune, it's just, there's probably like everywhere you turn, there's probably, it's almost going to turn into a cult if you don't be, if you're not careful, you know?
Yeah. 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 I know what you mean. Well, my final question to you is actually going back to your own personal life story, I'm wondering what your own takeaway of your life story to you is. You know, once we tell our stories, we let it out in the ether and people can do with it whatever they want. They can frame it in any which way. It could be a story about a precocious child. It could be whatever it is. But to you, in your honest heart, like what is your, your childhood at the Lyman family story about?
Hmm. It's a big question. Um, I guess it's like the same question as why did I feel that it was necessary to write it? No, that's not the same question. What is it about?
Like if you never wrote a story and you never had to answer to anyone and no one took your story and the people in the you know in the back in the commune wouldn't listen to you personally.
I'm having such a hard, I keep thinking of something to say and I'm like, no, that's not quite right. Um, I guess it's about family, but that's not even really right either. I can't believe I worked that hard to write a book and I don't know what it's about.
No, the reason I'm asking is because we make a narrative of our story, which
Mm.
is one thing, but also the way we tell it to others in order for them to understand it is different from the way we hold it in our hearts.
I think it's a story about survival
Yeah.
and the complicated nature of survival. You know, sort of what you have to sacrifice to survive. And I mean, that's what I feel when I tell the story and when I talk about the story is like I survived that, and I'm not, you know, and that's something that I'm proud of. I don't know, or you know, I survived it, and you know, not without getting somewhat scathed along the way, but I think it is, you know, I often think that my book didn't do as well as it could have because it was too hard to read. I could have, like, there's a softer version of that book that would have sold better, but I
What do
was
you mean it
like,
was too?
not gonna,
I gobbled it up in a day.
but you said earlier, and many have said it's hard to read. There, you know, there are parts of it where I just do not shy away from the sexual abuse and the
Yes,
violence and
yes.
that you know, the really hard stuff that happened to me. And I was determined to not be vague about that stuff because you get all the way here, like you don't want to soft pedal it. But I feel like maybe for some people, it's like, are you going to take this book and say to your friend, you should read this? Like, here's a very traumatic thing. I think that that might be part of like, you know, the challenge of it. It's not a, I mean, it has a happy ending, but it gets very dark.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, if I had it to do over, I wouldn't change a thing because I wouldn't know how to do that. But I do think that it's a book that upsets people.
It's very upsetting. I think also people want to situate abuse in the commune because then they can tell themselves that it happens there and they don't have to worry about it happening to them. And the fact that it happened after you left is, I think, very crushing to people because it says, well, you know what? You're not safe. You're not in this perfect utopia and they're in this horrible world. And it's a real challenge to readers.
Yeah,
It,
that's true too. And I I love that irony. I mean, that's one of the things that reasons I want to tell the story. I'm like, no, the cult part was not the bad part. You know,
yeah.
I mean, you know, I may have lost perspective. There were child brides and lots of violence, and you know, it wasn't there were things in hindsight, but it was not as bad as what happened next. You know what I mean? I joked with my editor, can I call my book Frying Pan Fire? She was like, no.
That's a good one. I like it.
Yeah.
It's a,
And then
I
she
do
was it
think,
was too cheeky.
I say it's a good title. Oh, thank you so much. Do you still sew? You used to do this, all the needlework. I don't
Oh
know what
yeah,
it's called.
I thought I had that. Bargello, yeah.
Bargello. Can we
Um,
see? I didn't know what
yeah,
Bargello is.
it's in Brooklyn. I don't have it here. The one that I actually have, the Bargello that I was working on when I left, which is a pillow.
Wow.
I was at my dad's house right after he died, and I was like, "What? This object is still alive, and it's in my dad's house." So I actually have it. The very little piece of Bargello that I was carting around with me, and then I finished out in the real world. I do. I crochet still, which is a thing I did a lot as a kid.
Wow.
I liked. I There's, for people who don't have this in their life, making something, like even if it's just like a simple crocheted scarf, people just get so moved by that. Actually, these skills these very, like, lady skills that I can't remember not knowing, is because that's just how I grew up. They serve me well as an adult.
Yeah.
It's a good skill to have. I would not have the patience to learn that as an adult. So
Yeah.
silver linings. There are
Silver
many
line.
things that I've been able to bring into my life in a meaningful way that doesn't I don't associate with bad things.
Well, you should send
Also,
me
I
a
can
picture of the. You can what?
I can milk a goat. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't look like I can milk a goat, but I can milk a goat.
Very funny. Any other hidden
Yeah, so
talents?
um, I can't play the banjo anymore. I used to be able to. No, just a lot of needlework and a lot of animal husbandry.
Do you have animals up in Syracuse?
Oh no, I wish. I don't have real amount of property.
Oh.
I will consider it a mark of my success when I can have a goat.
Oh, that'd be sweet. I was randomly thinking of the story of you and that rat the other day. It so impacted me, that rat. So,
He was a
animals.
mouse, but we called him Ratso. Yeah, I know
Oh, right,
that
right.
story. That was one of those things that I was like, oh yeah, and I started writing it, and all of a sudden it just became this epic journey, and I had almost forgotten how much this mouse meant to me, and how instrumental this mouse was in my friendship. And I mean, I feel like it takes up half the book. It's a
That's a
very
great
long piece
story.
of the book, really just like 2 days.
But it's not really about the mouse. It becomes a story about status in this little ecosystem you were in, which was something I found
Mm,
really fascinating. As you have a small group of people, like almost incestuous group of people, hierarchy becomes so important. Who's on top and who's on the bottom, and through that particular story with a sick mouse that you were trying to nurse back to health, I really got the sense of how important hierarchy becomes within it. So it's not really, oh Gwen, I wish you would leave. The reader instead is like, oh Gwen, I wish you would rise in this world, when really on the larger scale is it really important.
yeah, yeah. I know that mouse was a real turning point in my life because it bonded me with Daria, which got me traveling with the fancy people. Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks,
in the
Ratso.
caravan. Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you. I so thank you for your time. Good luck with the podcast. Is there anything we can tell the viewers to check out? Anything in particular? Your book is "When the World Didn't End" by Guinevere Turner. Anything else we should say? Social media that we want to link?
Just show it in the book since I happen to have copies on my shelf. That's the book. That's me.
Lovely.
Um, uh, just that I mean, social media, I'm not super present on, but I'm easy to find. You'll know it's me. Um, I am working on, in addition to the podcast, an adaptation of my book to become a limited series, hopefully. So look for that. And if anyone's interested in other kind of cult related media, I wrote a movie. I'm a screenwriter mostly by profession, and I wrote a movie called Charlie Says that came out in 2019. And it's about the women who killed for Charles Manson, and focuses on their time in prison and about on sort of what brainwashing is and how they sort of got unbrainwashed. And I'm very proud of that movie because I really brought a lot of my own personal experience into kind of crafting and imagining and trying to take a viewer through how someone gets sucked into a cult, because that's, you sort of see them get sucked in as you're also seeing the 7 years later what they're doing in prison. So I just recommend that for people who are interested in thoughtful, complex representations of cults.
Excellent. I'll check it out as well. Well, thank you so much, Guinevere, and thank you everyone for watching on YouTube, listening on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Frida.